second of our 6 meetings on the teaching of Pope Francis. And last month, you remember, we looked at Pope Francis's life. I'm sure there were people who didn't enjoy it, but all the people who spoke to me said they did and found it helpful to hear about his life. And I certainly found it very helpful to prepare it. And I constantly found that when I look at Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, you can see all kinds of things which are coming straight out of his life experience. Quite often with these papal documents, the Pope himself doesn't actually write them. You know, he gets somebody else to write them for him. But there's all kinds of evidence, I think, that a lot of this was written by Pope Francis himself. So tonight we're going to look at Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, which is the first document that he produced. And so I should have written that one there. I thought I'd give you a nice wee picture of him there, which you'd expect with a document called The Joy of the Gospel. And that one there, of course, that particular version is the book which at least 20 people in the parish paid good money for at the time. So you'll recognise it. Hope you have seen it since then. It's on the couch somewhere. This document has to be seen in its historical context, and there are 3 particular moments that I've identified. In the 1960s, Pope Paul VI produced the masterpiece on this subject, which was Evangelii Gaudium, the announcing of the gospel. It's a fantastic document, which I would encourage you to read. The wonderful thing about the internet now is you can get access to any of these things. So that was Pope Paul VI, my own favourite Pope. Pope John Paul II talked about new evangelization a lot. And so the phrase became a well-known phrase. But the person who began to actually do something about it was Pope Benedict, who set up the Pontifical Council for the new evangelization in 2010. He put in charge of it Archbishop Salvatore Fisichella Dino, is known as. He actually was in Scotland last week, and he's quite often in Scotland. Quite a number of the priests know him because he taught theology at the Gregorian University. Willie McFadden, who's giving our next talk, knows him well. When he took on the job, as I've explained to people before, he said that the new evangelization, the re-evangelization, although at the beginning they tended to think more about Europe than the world, but certainly the present Pope has spread it out much more. He said it would be a task that would take at least 150 years. So we're not talking about something that's going to happen in a year or two. Not talking about something that we're going to see fulfilled. Like the prophets before us, we just glimpse the future. But it's about re-evangelizing the world. I put that bit in about the mission metropolis when I did this little bit of the talk in Kilmarnock. I asked people if they'd ever heard of it, and nobody had. Have any of you heard of it? No. And neither had I, because it's just a little indication of how big the task is, because it's something he tried. He had these big meetings in the major cities of the world, and nobody's ever heard of them, you know. So it just reminds us of how difficult a task it is. And in 2013, this commission took over responsibility for catechism, and that's Archbishop Fisichella, right? Let's probably look at his face. We start with a few words of his, and I'm going to be reading lots of words tonight, so I'll explain to people coming in. The theory is that you shouldn't put texts up on a PowerPoint and then read them out to people. But we're dealing here with a document, and you can't avoid reading what it actually says. No, so there's going to be a good bit of actual reading of the document. But these words are from Archbishop Fisichella, and it kind of takes us to the heart of what we'll be hearing all night. This is not about religious things, it's about personal faith. It's about coming to know God, coming to know Jesus. And those are not comfortable words for many Catholics. They don't know what you're talking about. He also says that day by day, Pope Francis challenges us to find a new language, not only to be able to understand people in our days, but also to reach people in their own condition. I think this is a true challenge for the Church. And I've been saying that to people for years, I'm afraid, that we need a new language. We have to find new words to express old truths. We cannot just keep repeating the same old medieval phrases and medieval words and expect the modern world to understand them. The world today doesn't think the way people thought in the past. Philosophy has changed the whole way in which we see the world. Perhaps the most difficult task we face is the fact that the Church has come out of a world where truth was objective into a world where truth is subjective. Truth is what you think it is. Everyone's entitled to their own truth. That would have been unintelligible to people in another age. As explained at the funeral recently, some of you were at. Aristotle described truth as the mind in conformity with reality. That there was a reality out there, and your mind had to be in conformity with it, because if it wasn't, you were wrong. But not today. It's still true in the scientific world, but it's not true in the world of ideas. Whatever you want, you can think it. Nobody's allowed to challenge it, and so on. It's a whole different world. I'm not saying it's bad that the world's like that, but we have to learn a new way of speaking to it. We can't just keep shouting louder, you know, like English people abroad, hoping that the foreigners will understand you. New evangelization, he says, it means to realise and to have a consciousness of our necessity to go out to communities and reach people where they live and where they desire to have an encounter with Jesus. And I think that last phrase is hugely important, because what it implies is that people out there actually do want to have an encounter with Jesus. They want to have an encounter with God. Atheism is a rejection of a false God, really. But deep down in people, he's saying that they desire God. They might not put that word on it, but there is a desire for God, deep in human nature. And we have to go out there and touch into that in people with a language that they can understand. So that was Archbishop Fisichella on the whole general question of the new evangelization. And now we turn to Evangelii Gaudium itself and the opening words. The highlighting is mine, of course. The joy of the gospel fills the hearts and the lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness and loneliness. God, if ever there's a description of modern society for many people, it's that, emptiness and loneliness. With Christ, joy is constantly born anew. In this exhortation, that's the document, I wish to encourage the Christian faithful to embark upon a new chapter of evangelization marked by this joy, while pointing out new paths for the Church's journey in the years to come. It said, an evangelizer, the Pope says, must never look like someone who's come back from a funeral. That's the famous. That was one of those remarks which got into the press. Let us recover and deepen our enthusiasm, he says. May the world be enabled to receive the good news, not from evangelizers who are dejected, discouraged, impatient or anxious, but from ministers of the gospel whose lives glow with fervour, who have first received the joy of Christ. If that hasn't happened to us, then we can't evangelize anybody. And so a couple of times, I'm going to ask you just for a few minutes, just with the people beside you, to talk about those questions. I know that's a ridiculously short time to answer questions like that, but is there anything anybody would want to say about it? Just for a second or two, because we have a lot of stuff to look at.
I think the reason that parishes are diminishing in their attendance is because people don't feel that they belong. They don't feel that this joy they feel that they're segregated from the life of the community or the life of the church that they might want to participate in.
Right. Thanks, Martin.
But at the same time, there's over 50 folk here that are miserable till they need to change it. That is a testimony.
I know there's football on the telly. Yeah, well,
I think a lot of people feel joy after the meetings like this. Go home and talk about it.
so there's some hope, is there? Yeah. I mean, I think week passing Sunday we had incredible joy here when the children preparing for First Communion came along. I think it was a very powerful occasion. Anyway, that's I mean, joy is at the heart of it. Just a word about faith. Again, these are all quotes. I invite all Christians everywhere to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ. No one should think that this invitation is not meant for him or her, since no one is excluded from the joy brought by the Lord's. It's that personal encounter with Jesus Christ, and I kind of mentioned earlier, but it's true of other people as well. A lot of people just do not comprehend that notion of a personal relationship with Jesus, a personal relationship with God. You think that's true? I'm sure it's true in other churches as well. You don't think it's true?
I think anyone who would claim to be Catholic or Christian has a personal relationship.
They may have one, but do they recognise it?
That's a different question.
We all have one, undoubtedly. But it's whether we recognise it. I think when you talk to a lot of people in our churches about a personal relationship with God, they think you're daft. You're taking it all far too seriously. That's been my experience over 40 odd years as a priest. And yet, that's what faith is. And the Pope will reinforce that with some very strong words later. I mean, he doesn't...
What do you mean by a personal relationship?
That's a good question. If you have a personal relationship with Danny, what does that mean?
I'm getting a literal.
It means that you know each other. You relate to each other, you communicate with each other, you trust each other. Those would be signs of a relationship, wouldn't they? Anyway, thought. And this, I think, is the heart of the matter. Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. Now, there will be ethical implications, there will be political implications, there will be all kinds of implications of a relationship with God or with Jesus. But political action, even in favour of the poor and so on, or for any other purpose, which doesn't grow out of a personal relationship with Jesus, is valid, it's worthwhile in itself, but it's not what it's not what Christianity is about. Christianity begins with a relationship with God, and everything flows from that. And that's what the whole business of re-evangelization is about. It has to begin with ourselves. The fruits of faith, the Pope says, the gospel offers us the chance to live life on a higher plane, but with no less intensity. Thanks to this encounter, we're liberated from our narrowness and our self-absorption. It's not by proselytizing, that's going and looking for converts that the church grows, but by attraction. So we don't need to go to the streets and proclaim the gospel at the street corner, shouting at folk as they go about their legitimate business. It's not about that. At least not in the Evangelii Gaudium's understanding. Again, just for a couple of minutes. What do the words personal encounter with Jesus mean to you? The Pope asked this question, what was your 4 o'clock in the afternoon moment? It seems a very strange question, but it's about the first chapter of John's Gospel, where it says that the 2 disciples who were with John saw Jesus going past, and they said to him, Master, where do you live? And Jesus says, come and see. And then it says, it was about the 10th hour. So that was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. What do you find attractive about the church? I was going to put in if anything, but I decided just for another couple of minutes, would you have a chat about those? Okay. If I were asking you to solve all the problems, I'd give you at least another 2 minutes. Anything to say, just very briefly?
If we take the church being us, we have a church. The attractiveness of our small community and out with that, it seems to be, very, very positive. There's a very positive force there, a very attractive force, a very welcoming, happy force.
Do you think the church is actually part of the SAC problem, but in that it doesn't do some of the things that the last slide said it should do, like grow by attraction rather than proselytising? Dogma gets in the way.
I don't know if you heard the Archbishop of Canterbury the other night, when he was challenged. He encouraged companies to pay the living wage on the minimum. And then it turned out the Church of England wasn't doing that. And he was quite open about it. He said, we don't practice everything that we preach. That is what we were talking about last night in the other meeting. I nearly put an article in the back of the bulletin on Sunday from the Guardian, but James Montgomery would have objected. So
I would have disagreed. I wouldn't object.
It was by Giles Fraser. Remember the fellow who resigned from St Paul's when they threw out the protesters? He was making the point that he was proud to be a hypocrite. Because Christians are all hypocrites, he says, because we aspire to something great, but we never achieve it. So there's always a gap between our aspirations and the reality, and we just have to live with it. And that's the way it is. But you have to keep having a vision that you're trying to aspire to. So here we have the fundamental problem with success. The great danger in today's world, pervaded as it is by consumerism, is the desolation and anguish. They're very modern words. Anguish, angst. Angst, I take it, means anguish. Larissa, is it? Born of a complacent yet covetous heart, the feverish pursuit of frivolous pleasures and a blunted conscience. Whenever our interior life becomes caught up in its own interests and concerns, there is no longer room for others, no place for the poor. Is that a fair description of the sickness in our society? Not that we're entirely sick, but we suffer from doses of sickness. Do you recognise that? That's true.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Shallowness, yeah. And people don't like that. People are looking for something better. I'm convinced personally, especially from a time in the prison, and Danny might like to comment because he was there for years as well. He was there of course as a chaplain. But that's that. It's that. Where is it again? Desolation and anguish is about. That lies at the root of the drugs problem. I've got absolutely no doubt about that. That people are looking for quite artificial ways of finding their way to something which actually is a religious pursuit. It's actually a spiritual journey. But they're trying to get there quickly by artificial means instead of by living their lives to the full. Anyway, I personally think that is the situation. And so again, just for a minute or two, I'll give you the words back, just for a minute or two. Then, after that, I don't think I'll have time to too much. That's 3 questions facing the 21st century that we've answered. So, Pope Francis' answer, of course, is a people who know Jesus personally, just to go over it, a people filled with Christian joy, and a people filled with a missionary spirit, a church which looks outward. So that's Pope Francis' general answer. These are some of the issues that are raised in the course of the document. Originally, my plan was to perhaps look at each of them, look at the different chapters, but I decided that there was no, it would take forever, and I don't think it would be the right thing to do. So those are some of the issues, the main issues that people would pick out of the document. And what we're going to do now is to look at the actual text. Perhaps have a moment to let the words sink in. And if people want to comment either on the actual words or the reaction that they have stirred in you, what you have felt as you've read them, that's basically what I think we'll do for the rest of the time, if that's okay. So we have quotes from Evangelii Gaudium, and you get fed up with me reading them out, so I have all the slides have all been handed out to people as you came in. So you'll have a different voice reading each one, okay? And so the first one is entitled, it's about the parish. I thought we'd start with that.
The parish is not an outdated institution. If the parish proves capable of self-renewal and constant adaptivity, it continues to be the church living in the midst of the homes of her sons and daughters.
That's a quote from John Paul II, as you see.
We must admit, though, that the call to renew our parishes has not yet sufficed to make them environments of living communion and participation, and to make them completely mission-orientated.
The numbers here are from the actual document. Just for a second, just ponder those words. Would it be true to say that we must admit that the call to renew our parishes has not yet sufficed to make them environments of living communion and participation, and to make them completely mission-oriented? Is there still a lot to be done in that area?
Start.
Huge.
We have started.
Okay.
Pastoral ministry, who's reading that list? Bob gets his glasses changed.
Pastoral ministry in a missionary style is not obsessed with the disjointed transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be instantly imposed. The message has to concentrate on the essentials, on what is most beautiful, most grand, most appealing, and at the same time most necessary. The message is simplified while losing none of its depth and truth, and thus becomes more forceful and convincing.
Just a moment to let that sink in. That's a change from what we've known in the past, isn't it? A transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be insistently imposed. That's the church we've known, isn't it? He'll get worse than that, or stronger than that as he goes on. Spiritual worldliness. We talked about this last week. It was a huge theme in Jorge Bergoglio's life. It was probably the main theme in his life when he was in Argentina and Buenos Aires, and it still is. So who's reading that one for us? Right. Derek.
Spiritual worldliness. Spiritual worldliness, which hides behind the appearance of piety and even love for the church, consists in seeking not the Lord's glory, but human glory and personal well-being. But if it were to seep into the church, it would be infinitely more disastrous than any other worldliness, which is simply moral.
Thanks, Derek. That's a quote. The last bit's a quote from Henri de Lubac, who was one of the great theologians of the 20th century. He was the one who was made a cardinal at the age of 90, when John Paul II basically apologised to all the people who'd suffered during the 30s, 40s and 50s, and who laid the foundation for the council, but who were condemned and given a hard time. And de Lubac lived long enough to see the ideas fulfilled, and be made a cardinal was a kind of reward to everybody. It was a kind of sorry to all the rest. Is that true? Which hides behind the appearance of piety. Even love for the church. But it consists in seeking not the Lord's glory, but human glory and personal well-being. And that can happen at so many levels. The Pope has been brutally frank in his speaking to the Curia in Rome about this kind of thing, you know, about careerism and dressing up and all that kind of stuff. But it can happen in a parish. You know, people have done that over who looks after the kiosk and who cleans the church and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it can appear in any shape or form, that kind of thing. And there are two forms of this evil, the Pope says. So who's reading the first one?
They can actually.
Right.
One is the attraction of Gnosticism, a purely subjective faith whose only interest is a certain experience or set of ideas and bits of information which are meant to console or enlighten, but which ultimately keep one imprisoned in his or her own thoughts and feelings.
Just like that's thinking. Gnosticism, as you know, was one of the great heresies of the early church, which has never gone away. And the reason it's so seductive is because it sounds very spiritual and holy. But it's elitist. But that whole business of imprisoned in his or her own thoughts and feelings, unable to move out of that narrow world in which we live. And again, my experience over 46 years of the priest is there's been a constant battle against that. And most of the other things that the Pope says as we go along. This is the second form of that evil. Who's got that one?
Me.
Right, Marianne.
The other is the self-absorbed neo-Pelagianism of those who ultimately trust only in their own powers and feel superior to others because they observe certain rules or remain intransigently faithful to a particular Catholic style from the past. A supposed soundness of doctrine or discipline leads instead to a narcissistic authoritarian elitism whereby, instead of evangelizing, one analyzes and classifies others, and instead of opening the door to grace, one exhausts his or her energy in inspecting and verifying.
Any comments? Even if there's a particular phrase or 2 or 3 words that really strike you, then just read them out again, you know, from the screen, just say them.
Pharisee is the word that comes to mind.
You observe certain rules or remain transiently faithful to a particular Catholic style from the past. God, we're riddled with that, aren't we? Absolutely riddled with it. And that classifying others, you know, sitting in judgment on others, inspecting and verifying. Someone once said that morality for Christians is not so much something you live by, as something you judge others by. It's absolutely true. Here's a long one. No to spiritual worldliness. The Pope has a whole series of no's, no to this, no to that, no to the next thing. Some of them we'll see later, but most of them we'll deal with in the fourth talk in 2 months' time. But who's reading that one? Right, Michael.
This insidious worldliness is evident in a number of attitudes. In some people we see an ostentatious preoccupation for the liturgy, for doctrine and for the church's prestige, but without any concern that the gospel have a real impact on God's faithful people and the concrete needs of the present time. In this way, the life of the church turns into a museum piece or something that is the property of a select few. It can translate into a concern to be seen, into a social life full of appearances, meetings, dinners and receptions. It can also lead to a business mentality caught up in management, statistics, plans and evaluations whose principal beneficiary is not God's people but the church as an institution. Is that true?
Sounds like some bishops, I know.
Sounds like some lay people I know as well. I mean, it's right, absolutely. We're all involved. Again, I repeat, if there's a particular word in it that struck you, or a short phrase, just read it out to us again. And if somebody else says the one you were going to read, then read it again, because if that's the one which is striking people.
But the church as an institution, it's about holding up that institution. The whole sex abuse scandal was about maintaining the institution and defending it.
A lot of these comments to me could apply to many large organisations as well as the church. I've worked in large organisations all my life and I recognise that.
That's right.
But that's what they're for, those organisations. The church is to be different from that.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of behaviour gets in the way of organisational objectives.
For me, it was the failure to respond to the concrete needs of the present time.
That's the same as the previous one, hanging on to old.
Yeah.
The liturgy is a straight jacket.
Yeah.
And the church turns into a museum piece.
Good. And we're getting better at this. That one doesn't have a title. It's still going on in the same theme. Is that you, Tom?
Yes. And those who have fallen into this worldliness look on from above and afar. They reject the prophecy of their brothers and sisters. They discredit those who raise questions. They constantly point out the mistakes of others, and they are obsessed with appearances. Their hearts are open only to the limited horizon of their own interests. This is a tremendous corruption disguised as a good. We need to avoid it by making the church constantly go out from herself. The stifling worldliness can only be healed by breathing in the pure air of the Holy Spirit, who frees us from self-centeredness, clothed in an outward religiosity bereft of God.
Thanks, Tom. Feel free to read out any ones that strike you.
The stifling worldliness can only be healed by breathing in.
Thanks, Derek.
I think the prophecy of their brothers and sisters, implying brothers and sisters are somehow outside or to the side and evangelised. And there's so many voices talk about the church, not least atheists who nothing very useful to read and to engage with.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The Holy Spirit who frees us.
To discredit those who raise questions. That's caused me a lot of anxiety over the years. I thought I'd put that in, because that's a kind of... Well, you could say that it's unfair, but that's exactly the kind of thing that the Pope has slated them for. And said we've got to break away as a system.
the lace makers out of work.
Now, who's got the bruised church? Yes.
I repeat to the whole church what I have often said to the priests and laity of Buenos Aires. I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting and dirty because it has been out in the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. More than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us feel safe, while at our door people are starving, and Jesus does not tire of saying to us, give them something to eat.
Any phrases strike you?
I think the false sense of security.
This brings up a picture to me of the prodigal.
Thanks.
But we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up.
Shut up, yeah.
We're bruised, hurting and dirty, sitting because you would think you'd be repelled by that, you would avoid that instead of reaching it.
Those of you who were here last time, which is most of you, or maybe have looked at the last talk on the internet, will recognise, of course, that after it, well, before even during the 70s, 80s, all his life really in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, his concern for the poor was enormous, although it underwent that great change, which, you know, that debate between Valerie and what's his name? Oh, I forgot his name. Doesn't matter. But I mean,
the one thing I think we need is that the Church of Scotland has had talk about a church without walls,
yes,
but it's run back into the walls. Yes. And I think this is the thing that, as Christians, we've got to realise that the wall isn't a place of security. It's only a place that you work out from.
Yes, absolutely. That was a good phrase the Church of Scotland had, the church without walls. I just like the whole idea of a bruised church. Just that, as I said already, the two talks from now is about a kind of Christian view of economics based on the church's social teaching, about which Pope Francis has quite a bit to say in this document. But who's got this one?
No to an economy of exclusion. No to the new idolatry of money. No to a financial system that rules rather than serves. Some people continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth, encouraged by the free market, will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting.
Any phrases?
Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting.
This is one of the bits the Pope was publicly attacked for, mainly among right-wing conservative Catholics in the United States, who accused him of being a Marxist. And it reminds me of in the 70s held at Camera, the Archbishop, the Bishop of Recife in Brazil, that he famously said that when I feed the hungry, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're hungry, they call me a communist. That was his famous. That's something that we will look at in a separate talk. Danny and Tim Duffy from the Justice and Peace Commission in Glasgow are going Have you started thinking about it, Dan?
Think about it, watch
But I mean, that's a huge topic. Here we have consumerism. Who's going to read? Thanks.
Consumerism. We have created new idols. The worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise, in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose. The worldwide crisis affecting finance and the economy lays bare their imbalances and, above all, their lack of real concern for human beings. Man is reduced to one of his needs alone: consumption.
Any comments?
What's very striking about this is that if you look at the abuse that was hurled at certain Anglican bishops recently, I wasn't aware of the kind of uproar. Maybe it's because he's speaking in Latin, you know. But
no, he doesn't speak Latin.
Is it not? Sorry, it's not really. I just wonder why I wasn't aware, certainly in this country, of the kind of criticism directed at the Pope that was directed last week, I think it was, at these guys, and ladies as well, in the Church of England.
The Catholic Church of England has issued a statement today as well, I think.
Sorry, Joe?
I think the Catholic Church of England today, I think, has issued a letter which is very strong as well.
Right.
It basically criticises the government for its attitude to the poor and encourages people in the election to vote for a party that will do something for the poor. So I think that's I think what we have to recognise, of course, is that we're up to our eyes in that, aren't we?
Absolutely. You like this jumper?
And it's very, very difficult to know what you do in the midst of it, because I mean, there are no easy solutions to this, and that's one of the criticisms of the Pope, that he doesn't really provide solutions and alternatives. But I don't think it's his job to do that. I think it's his job to challenge, because we're caught up, you know, we're like gerbils or something in a wheel. You know, we've got to keep consuming, because if we don't consume, everything goes down the tubes. You know, so we're just going round in circles faster and faster, trying to keep the whole thing going. And where do you go from there? Does anybody have any thoughts on where you go from there?
Yeah, a new jumper.
Well, you consume less and spread the balance around the people who don't consume anything.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I mean, we're all entitled to a jumper. It's very cold in Scotland. But you maybe need to pay 150 quid for it. That's Spencer's is fine.
Not even that. But we've got to collectively do that. We can't individually. We're not strong enough individually to do it.
But
we've got to do it as community.
Collective starts with an individual.
Yes, we've got to get together as these individuals that want to do this, and share our will to do it.
Remember,
I think that's the crux of it.
Absolutely. In the 1970s, when our generation was younger, I remember there were quite a few people. There was a crowd of them in here, you may remember, Danny. And they were all middle class, well-off people. Well, they were middle class at the time with young families, so but they tried sharing stuff, you know, sharing lawnmowers and all that kind of stuff. You know, they shared them all in common. It was an ideal. I mean, but somehow or other we need to figure out ways of trying to do something about that.
I think also activism is, you know, one element, but what struck me was man is reduced to one of his needs alone. Yeah. Even what we talk about at our workplaces, and you know, what do we discuss with our peers and our colleagues? That can fuel consumerism or other values.
Because people have been robbed of other things to talk about.
I think the other thing with the consumption, if we think of George Orwell in 1984, and he had gone through the experiences of both the Spanish Civil War and the war, the consumption of war. I always wondered about my parents that had gone through the 30s where you couldn't get a job, and in 10 years later they were just spending money like there was no tomorrow, in weapons and everything was just thrown away.
Yes. Well, I repeat, there's no easy solution to this, but I mean, David's right, what the Pope says is far stronger than we would get away with here. And even some of those things about church and the liturgy and all the rest of it, I would be wary of saying that in some places, because I've had that much hassle about it over the years. I'm just so happy to hear the Pope saying it. And you can just go, that's not me, it's the Pope.
Just do it.
I'll give you some pictures to look at for a minute. I think you know what they all are. One at the top left is the City of London, but it says that underneath it. We've got the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and a fella protesting there. Can you see what he's... You can all read it, yeah?
It's quiet.
Imperialistic capitalism meeting in process. I think that's the IMF building, I think, on the left, I think so. So that just be... That's very well informed about the city, Joe. Yeah, absolutely. That's where all the money is. Who's got the tomb mentality? Right, Paul?
A tomb mentality develops and slowly transforms Christians into mummies in a museum. Disillusioned with reality, with the church and themselves, they experience a constant temptation to cling to a faint melancholy, lacking hope, which seizes their heart like the most precious of the devil's potions. Called to radiate light and communicate life, they are caught up in things that generate only darkness and inner weariness, and slowly consume all zeal for the apostolate. Let's not allow ourselves to be robbed of the joy of evangelization.
That phrase in inverted commas was from John the 23rd at the opening of the Second Vatican Council. Most precious of the devil's potions. Anything else in it that strikes you?
I think going back to what you were saying earlier, he doesn't offer solutions, and there might, if people find themselves in those circumstances, then how to raise themselves.
He does offer a solution in the sense that right at the beginning he talks about the key is a personal relationship with God and Jesus, and that would transform everything. That is his solution, but that doesn't make a lot of sense to lots of people. Because the whole business of evangelization is turning outwards instead of turning inwards. That's the key thing. You think there is melancholy and lacking hope and so on?
Disillusion is reality in the church. People need to be tough with that.
Yeah. Who's got open churches? Kenny?
The church is called to be the house of the Father, with doors always wide open. One concrete sign of such openness is that our church doors should always be open, so that if someone, moved by the Spirit, comes there looking for God, he or she will not find a closed door.
I thought I'd give you a neat picture. Because our church is open during the day.
We thought that was a step too far.
What do you...
Leaving the door of the church. Could you do that?
Can't do that now.
See, I think you could do it. You could do it for 2 or 3 years at a time. I mean, ours is open, but something could happen one day. But it happened even when the door was locked. And most of the people who are trying to do damage never dream of getting in the front door. They still go in the back door or through a window. Because it never closed behind church. But I think that's a chance you have to take. Churches used to be always open, and then they all get closed. And actually, the Catholic Church at that time always prided itself in that its doors were always open.
Yeah.
I think the kit was always closed. I think that's true, isn't it?
Yes.
But the Catholic Church were always open when some of us were young. And I think it's sad. I mean, in some places it probably is necessary. But the Pope's point is valid, isn't it?
Yes, very much so.
And the physical open door is only really a symbol of a much wider sense of which the door should be open.
I mean, I would agree with that. I agree with the Pope. I mean, we should be open.
You must be right then, Dan.
Yes. No, I mean, but looking at the people in Stevenson, the parish in Stevenson, we would think, no, we can't leave this door open. You know, because the place will be wrecked.
And would it be wrecked?
I don't think so, but
that's what people thought when you decided to open. Some people here said, oh.
I know that was about 3 years ago and nothing has happened. But that's not to say that something won't happen tomorrow.
There's a lot of people won't come near the church to visit. It's quiet, there's not really any just come to the
It's a great place to think.
Yeah.
Actually, the non-denominational praying rooms in hospitals.
Yeah, that's right.
Are the same. It's just a very quiet place you can go.
Airports are the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. And certainly the cathedrals of Europe for hundreds of years were places for people in and out. I'm sure they sometimes get things stolen as well. Homilies, it's a whole section, pages on homilies, and since then, and I thought that was quite humorous. Who would like to read it for us?
You.
We know that the faithful attach great importance to it, and that both they and their ordained ministers suffer because of homilies. The laity from having to listen to them, and the clergy from having to
That's true, isn't it?
No.
Yes, it is. In general.
In general, it's true. I think there are bits like that run through it that show the Pope's humour as well. You know, there's certainly bits that. Who's going to read out a confession?
I want to remind priests that the confessional must not be a torture but rather an encounter with the Lord's mercy, which spurs us on to do our best. Everyone needs to be touched by the comfort and attraction of God's saving love, which is mysteriously at work in each person, above and beyond their faults and failings.
Any thoughts?
Such a great writer. Assuming he wrote it himself, but he's so good with words and making stuff feel so much.
Yeah.
Torture chamber. It's brilliant.
Yeah, only he could have written that because no Monsignor in Rome would humour use a language like that. You know, it would be highfalutin language.
So you can understand.
I was going to go to confession just before Christmas, but I got it repeated because the priest was sick. I thought, that's God gave me a wee blessing here. I was glad to sleep.
I mean, there's a real crisis over that particular subject. But it seems to me it's very much tied up with what you were saying earlier about being tied up in rules and regulations and doctrines. It's meant to be an experience of God's healing love. And at its best it can be that. Atheism, who's going to read the atheism to?
Today our challenge is not so much atheism as the need to respond adequately to many people's thirst for God. Unless people find in the church a spirituality which can offer healing and liberation, they will end up being taken in by solutions which neither make life human nor give glory to God.
Again, I think there's the implication there that in actual fact there are loads of people out there who are thirsting for God without being able to give it that name. They're thirsting for meaning, they're thirsting for something deeper, They're thirsting for something better. And in many, many cases, the reason they've walked away from the church, as I said earlier, is because we've given them a load of garbage in place of the truth. Any other? I thought we'd end with letting Jesus have a word or two. A couple of phrases from the Gospel. I forgot to, I didn't give. Daniel, would you like to read these for us?
You are the salt of the earth. If salt loses its taste, what can make it salty again? It is fit only to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. No one puts a lamp under a tub. They put it in a lampstand so that it can give light to all around.
I think Jesus sums it up, do you not think? Okay, this enormous vocation which is to re-evangelise the world. But we can't do it until we sort ourselves out. That's not entirely true, because you're doing it while you're sorting yourself out, but there is so much that we need to look at, so much that needs to happen, so many things in ourselves that we need to examine. And the Pope throughout that document, and if you've got a copy of it, maybe you'll go back and read it, because there's lots more stuff in it. The Pope's inviting us to understand, to see what the problem is, and to address it. Even although, as Archbishop Fisichella says, we're talking about something here that will take 150, maybe 200 years. Hopefully, when people look back on this age, they'll call this, every age has a name, and they'll call this hopefully the age of renewal in the church. Any other thoughts? And the next talk with God is on March the 25th, a merciful church. And Father Lord McFadden will be going on to do that. So, it's 20 minutes to 9. Maybe we can go just now if you want. But is there anything anybody wants to say? Overall, your overall reaction to what the Pope's been saying?
This might be a stupid question, Julie. When the Pope releases an encyclical, do the priests all get together and talk about it, or?
You joke.
I don't know.
I'll guarantee you the diocese is full of priests who haven't read that. Guarantee it.
So how does it cascade down to us then? How we erase that, and there are how many million Catholics in the world?
Well, we're serialising it in the bulletin in Stevenson.
Right.
Good. We take chunks of it every week, and there's a wee section in the bulletin that is in it. And people find that quite interesting.
We didn't have events like this, or what you're doing. How do we, is it up to us? Are we supposed to go and buy it and get it ourselves?
Well, would anybody like to try and provide some kind of answer to Betty's question? I mean, how do we
cascade down to us?
There's an even more basic question, that is, I mean, we're all from this parish, you have your own parishes, but how do we actually implement it ourselves? There's so much there, all this hanging on to the past, all this rules and regulations and doctrines and stuff, which the Pope says, get rid of them, not get rid of it, but go to the essence, go to the things that are important, the things that are grand, the things that are attractive to people, like a whole new way of living. That somehow we have to communicate that to people. So how do we do it?
One of the first questions was the personal relationship with Christ. And I firmly believe it's like falling in love when you've met your Christ. And you want, if you fall in love, you want to tell someone. And that's the same once you've met Christ, the impact.
But how do we enable people to do it?
By the attitude your life transformed as soon as you have a personal contact and know that he's there. You change and people see that. You can't make it false. It just happens. And people can...
It just happens, well.
Oh, you have little faith.
No, you say it just happens. I mean, if it just happens, then I don't think it just happens.
One of the first things you've got to do is set out the proposal, if you can describe it as that, in that type of English, rather than preaching in biblical speak, which people don't understand. That's the clearest exposition I've ever heard of what I would argue is the fundamental core values of most of the world's monotheistic religions. It's all about this kind of stuff. And that's phenomenally clear. And I think that is a very, very powerful message just written like that itself.
Yes, yeah, just
But if we have a
if
we have a church where from the whole structure set up with this old way of thinking, which has existed for generations, how can that new sort of way of thinking be easily introduced? We as individuals would have great difficulty to actually do a lot. But there has to be some kind of diocesan or regional ways of looking at this and attacking it.
I think that obviously that's true. I suppose the other side is that we have had things, you know. Over the years, there's been a lot of attempts to do things. So there is undoubtedly the institution needs to think seriously about it, but people in parishes need to engage with it as well.
The thing I was going to say, I think as Christians we need a change of view. Most of the other religions encourage you to look inward and achieve an inner peace.
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas as Christians we really need to be looking outwards all the time, and because we're charged to look to our neighbours, not to ourselves.
Yes.
And by doing so it then comes.
That's right. The quote which talked about Gnosticism said that, because Gnosticism in the end is inward looking. It's a bit like Buddhism in that sense, you know, that it's enlightenment by going deeper and deeper into yourself. It used the word Pelagianism in the same slide. Pelagianism was a very ancient heresy. Said that you could achieve salvation by your own efforts fundamentally. It said, whereas the Christian view is that it's God's initiative, that it's grace, that it's gift, but that we have to open ourselves up to it. So we don't have to do it ourselves. God does it in us. That's the essence of it.
But you have to open yourself.
You have to open yourself up to it somehow
before you can then engage with other people.
The doctrine of the church is that you can't even open yourself up without grace. But I mean, that's a very complex. There's a whole. I mean, there's been poems written about that over the centuries, which is the relationship between grace and free will. It's not easy to. It's two truths that are too much for us to take in together. Anyway, that's another.
Someone said to me just recently that a few years ago now, you had something called Renew in the diocese,
Yes.
and that it was absolutely brilliant. And I said, well, what happened to it? She said, well, people just lost interest and didn't need to carry on. So again, it's back to people.
Yeah, I don't think that's entirely true actually, because there were lots of different opinions. That was the 1980s. But Renew was only kind of a boost. Lots of people's lives were changed by Renew. There are lots of people still around whose faith was deepened by Renew.
Right.
But if you look at the overall, it's difficult to see that it had a huge effect, but it had certainly a big effect on individuals' lives.
Right.
I think you started by talking about how we need to have a new language that speaks to people in the here and now and doesn't sound medieval. And a lot of that language is exactly that. So a few times when I read what he was saying, I was thinking it's like the Ten Commandments, but for today. And it's not you shall not, it's more think about this might be happening to you. It's like all those hidden weaknesses that we have that until you really consider it, you're not aware of it.
Yeah.
So I just think those two things. One is that he is starting to role model that new kind of language, and it's almost like a new kind of way, it's like a new set of governing principles.
I think the other thing we have to acknowledge, and maybe this is a negative note to end on, but there's a lot of opposition to him. A lot of people in the church are not happy with what he's saying. One Scottish bishop, who will remain anonymous, is supposed to have said, we needed a Peter and we got a Francis. And that's actually going to happen, because the people who have been appointed bishops in the church at the moment were appointed because they fitted in with another way of thinking. And if a pope comes along and changes it all, they're all like fish out of water. You know, they don't understand what he's talking about.
What's your view about the interpretation of the Old Testament? We still use it extensively, but it needs to be interpreted because it's full of sort of phrases, sayings, beliefs that were relevant 2,000 years ago. We don't understand now.
3,000 years ago in some cases, two and a half, 3,000.
Yeah. Why do we keep on with the Old Testament?
That's not the first time you've asked that question, Tom. You know, and it's a good question. Even in the time I've been here, I've heard you ask that question before. And it's a question that lots of people wonder about, because it's part of our history. It's not possible to understand our faith without a knowledge of the Old Testament.
If we take away Jesus' Jewishness, we lose the whole thread of it. He was a Jew.
Actually, he was a Jew.
Immersed in
and the whole language of Christianity. I mean, we do it all the time at Mass, and I've said before, the Lord be with you. That's straight from the Old Testament. The Lord be with you was the battle cry of the Lord is with us.
Yeah, but that's understandable. To me, anyway.
The rest of it is I mean, you're right, Tom. The rest of it is also understandable, but you need to study it, and the problem is, fundamentally, that we don't have the means to do that. When you come to Mass on a Sunday, you don't come to get a lecture, you don't come to study, you come to worship and pray. If you're going to study the Scriptures, you would need to come in here on a Tuesday or a Wednesday night and do that. You know, Sunday's not the place for that, except on a very small scale. But once you begin to understand the Old Testament, and we did a whole course on it 2 or 3 years ago, of course we only just touched on it, but once you begin to understand it, and it begins to make sense to you, then it's an incredibly profound thing. You see, we talk about the Old and the New Testament, that's a misnomer. We shouldn't really do that, because it's all the one thing. You know, it's an artificial division to say the Old and New Testament. It's a continuing story. But I agree with you, there are times when I just am in despair. You go in there and the reading is unintelligible to most people. And you don't always have time to deal with that. But as I've said a million times, the problem is not in the Bible. The problem is in us, in the sense that it's we that don't understand it. You know, it's like if people are speaking a foreign language, it's not their fault that you don't understand them. You know, we have to learn the language, and we have to learn the language of the Bible. I agree, Tom, there's a massive amount of work to be done there, and I don't know exactly how you do it.
I think that's a terrific question, because it strikes me, as someone who's not committed the way a lot of people are.
I don't overestimate that.
The conception of God, the Jewish God, is rather different from the Christian God. The Jewish God sanctions the most appalling things, as witnessed in the Old Testament, you know.
We've got one this Sunday.
Big one?
The first reading this Sunday is about Abraham being told to sacrifice Isaac.
Aye, but then there was what happened at Jericho and so on. So I mean, I think there is a radical break. I mean, that's the whole point about Christ, although he's a Jew and it's a Jewish faith originally before
Most people would say, David, that there is only one truth. genuinely new truth in the New Testament that's not in the Old Testament, and that's the Trinity. We talk about, you know, Jesus talking about love, but love your neighbour as yourselves from the Old Testament, it's not the New Testament. You know, so a lot of that stuff is in the Old Testament. You say the God of the Old Testament, I mean, if you look at that in terms of our own lives, the story of the Bible is the story of our people growing in their understanding of God, just as we all grow. So hopefully the God we relate to at this age is not the same God as we related to when we were 5-year-old. You know, so just as the people of the Old Testament grew in understanding, so each one of us has to grow in understanding as well. But I admit, it's because it belongs to a different culture, a different world.
Different context.
But we're part of it is part of our history. I mean, and it's not just the Bible that's full of strange words. I mean, we celebrate Burns every year, and Burns is full of words that nobody can understand. Shakespeare's full of words that nobody can understand. Chaucer, have you tried to read Chaucer? But it doesn't mean to say that they're not worth reading because they use a language that we don't understand. You have to learn the language. I mean, you take Jeremiah Hawkins for example, I don't know what he's talking about. But it's my fault, not his. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
I say I don't understand what he's talking about. Some of the times I do, but there are other times when I don't. You've got to get somebody like Ricardo to explain it to me.
In a few words, I think.
Well, anything else that anybody simply must say before they go? Right.